All right, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to investigate the absolute bedrock of environmental management system architecture under the ISO 14001:2026 standard. Specifically, we're zeroing in on how Clause 4.1, the context of the organization, literally forms the structural foundation for everything else that follows it. You know, if you've ever wondered why some environmental systems drive massive real-world change while others just kind of gather dust on a shelf, the answer almost always comes back to context. When an EMS is just gathering dust, it's usually because it was built as this purely theoretical exercise. And in today's landscape, mastering this standard is absolutely not just about ticking compliance boxes anymore. It is about sheer survival in an incredibly complex, fast-moving regulatory and ecological environment. So what actually happens when an environmental management system totally forgets the real world? Well, we have to establish right up front that an EMS is a highly dynamic architecture, and according to the source material, it's incredibly vulnerable to catastrophic failures when it ignores real-world conditions. Imagine a facility, right? They spend hundreds of hours, thousands of dollars designing this flawless, perfectly documented waste management system. But it turns out it's entirely based on local regulations that actually expired 3 years ago. If your system is built on theoretical assumptions rather than the actual ecological, regulatory, and technological realities of exactly where you operate, it's not just inefficient, it's literally a ticking time bomb. To really unpack this, we're going to follow a diagnostic blueprint today. First, we'll establish the foundation of context. Second, we'll trace how that context directly shapes system design. Third, the domino effect of failure. Fourth, we'll look at some cascading nonconformances in action. And finally, we'll break down how a lead auditor audits the traceability chain.
Okay, starting off with part 1, the foundation of EMS context.
So Clause 4.1 basically demands that an organization figure out the internal and external issues relevant to its purpose. We're talking about the dynamic reality where the organization actually operates. Think external pressures, like climate change regulations or stakeholder expectations, combined with internal realities like your tech capabilities and company culture. But look, there's a massive difference between superficial context and genuine context. Superficial context creates your classic paperwork EMS. It vaguely lists these generic issues, just literally copying and pasting buzzwords like climate change or regulatory pressure into a spreadsheet. Imagine a lead auditor reviewing a system like that. I mean, they're going to roll their eyes. They know instantly this organization is just going through the motions. Genuine context, on the flip side, identifies highly specific operational realities. It doesn't just vaguely say climate change. It says regional water scarcity requiring strict recycling. A strategic, context-driven EMS actually analyzes how specific environmental conditions interact with the facility's day-to-day operations. And that is exactly what an auditor expects to see, a system grounded in bespoke reality.
Moving right along to part 2, tracing context to design.
Okay, so once an organization actually figures out its genuine context, what happens next? Well, the standard dictates that this context absolutely must be directly linked to shape the entire system's design. And this brings us to a really crucial concept here, traceability. Traceability is defined as the demonstrable, logical linkage between identified contextual factors and the structured components of the EMS. Basically, think of traceability as the structural steel beams of a skyscraper. These beams connect the foundation, so your stakeholder requirements or ecological sensitivities, directly upward to specific planning decisions, risk assessments, and daily operational controls up on the top floors. What happens when you build a heavy operational control on a weak superficial foundation? The whole building collapses under its own weight. When auditors come in, they actively stress test these beams. If an auditor cannot trace a solid, logical line from the outside world straight into your daily procedures, the system is fundamentally flawed from the ground up.
Let's actually walk through how this flows in a healthy, highly functional system. It all starts with a contextual finding. Let's use that previous example. Your facility operates in a region facing severe ongoing water scarcity. Because of that real-world context, we move to step 2, aspect identification. Your facility's water consumption is immediately flagged as a highly significant environmental aspect. That naturally triggers step 3, the risk assessment phase, where you assess the critical risk of resource depletion or maybe severe regulatory fines if the local municipality starts rationing water, which leads logically right into the final step, operational control. You implement strict mandatory water recycling procedures out on the factory floor. Do you see how seamlessly that flows? The outside reality completely dictates the daily operational control. But here's where the friction often happens in the real world. Step 2 might be handled by some outside environmental consultant, while Step 3 is managed by corporate risk, and Step 4 just gets dumped on the local facility manager. Traceability is that vital thread that has to connect these totally disparate departments to make sure the system doesn't fracture.
Which brings us to part 3, The domino effect of failure.
Now we're going to put on our forensic investigator hats for a minute. What actually happens when that foundational context is cracked, or outdated, or just totally superficial? Well, superficial context analysis creates a systemic misalignment between operational realities, stakeholder expectations, and regulatory obligations. The absolute crucial point here is that a context failure is almost never an isolated event. It creates this completely false sense of security. A company might have these beautiful glossy documents that look just perfect in a binder, but they are entirely divorced from reality. Because the EMS is such a highly interconnected architecture, a seemingly minor oversight during that Clause 4.1 planning stage creates these massive systemic gaps that just ripple outward. A failure to understand the outside world infects your risk planning, it pollutes your resource allocation, and it completely undermines your operational controls.
Let's dive deeper into that in Part 4, Cascading Nonconformances in Action. Let's ground all this dense ISO standard text with a bit of a true crime breakdown, EMS style. We'll look at a fictional company. Let's call them Apex Chemicals. In month 1, Apex Chemicals totally fails to update its context analysis, and they completely miss a newly passed regional regulation that reclassifies a specific solvent they use as highly hazardous. Right there, that is a baseline Clause 4.1 failure. By month 3, because they miss that vital context, the Environmental Health and Safety Manager is looking at a risk register that's just glowing with green, low-risk indicators. Their compliance obligations are completely outdated. Boom, Clause 6 planning failure. By month 6, this false confidence has fully spread to the factory floor. The operators are doing exactly what their manual tells them to do. They're pouring this newly restricted solvent straight into the standard wastewater stream, committing an ongoing legal violation. That's a massive Clause 8 operational failure. And finally, by month 12, the internal audit team comes in and signs off on the facility with flying colors. Why? Because they are auditing against the company's own outdated context and flawed risk register. That is a catastrophic Clause 9 evaluation failure. One single context failure at the very start just crashed through planning, operations, and evaluation. It's a total systemic collapse.
And finally, Part 5, Auditing the Traceability Chain.
So how does an ISO 14001:2026 lead auditor actually catch these context-driven systemic nonconformances out in the wild? I'll tell you right now, an auditor doesn't just walk in and ask, "Hey, did you write down your context?" No way. They triangulate evidence to verify that traceability we talked about. They are going to dig into your strategic plans and risk matrices. But honestly, the real gotcha moments happen when they look at capital investment decisions. Imagine an auditor reading this beautifully designed ESG report where the company's stated context involves this massive commitment to reducing carbon emissions. Okay, sounds great. But then the auditor pulls the purchase orders for the last 3 quarters and discovers the facility just bought a whole fleet of outdated high-emission machinery simply because it was on sale at a steep discount. That auditor knows instantly that the context is just a generic template, not a genuine strategy. They cross-reference regulatory registers and stakeholder engagement records to prove definitively whether your EMS is actively listening to the real world or just generating empty paperwork.
I really want to highlight this quote from the source material because, honestly, it represents the ultimate paradigm shift in ISO 14001:2026. Traceability transforms environmental management systems from documentation frameworks into performance-oriented governance structures. This right here is the ultimate value of Clause 4.1. It's what elevates an organization from simply checking compliance boxes and hoarding binders of paper to actually governing their environmental impact. It shifts the entire focus from passive documentation to driving measurable, sustainable, and highly deliberate real-world performance.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought. Look closely at the systems that you manage or design or audit. Is your environmental management system truly built on a foundation of reality, tracing real-world context directly into your daily operational design? Or is it really just a paper exercise, completely disconnected from the outside world, just waiting for the first domino to fall? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive, and I really hope it provides you with a powerful new lens for analyzing and strengthening your own EMS architecture.